Hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for participating in EIANZ's first webinar session. We're running this ourselves, which is why we're able to offer it free to our members. Hopefully everything runs smoothly today, but please be understanding if there are any technical issues. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We also have a copy of the presentation available for you to download in the handout section of the control panel, so feel free to download and save the presentation to your computer. We also plan on recording the session as a video and uploading it along with the presentation to eianz.org at some point afterwards. I would now like to introduce Bryce Skarratt from BHP Billiton to take over and present BHP Billiton's strategic assessments of its Pilbara mining operations over the next 50 to 100 years. Bryce, I will hand over to you now.
And hopefully we're sorted.
Looks good on my end. All right, I'll let you take it from here.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for that. So welcome everyone, and thanks for coming along. It's a bit unusual. I'm sitting in an empty room addressing 50 odd people. So you'll just have to assume my hand gestures and facial expressions as we go along. So today I'll just introduce myself. Some of you I know, but my name's Bryce Skarratt. I'm currently with BHP Billiton Iron Ore based in Perth. My background's in environmental assessment, environmental management, which I've been doing for a large number of years now, based the last 7 years in Perth, but previously consulting in Brisbane and working on projects in all over Australia and some international projects as well on major project approvals. What I'm going to talk to you today about is the strategic environmental assessment that BHP Billiton has been working on for the last couple of years. It's been a really interesting process to be involved in, and I'm hoping that you'll find it interesting as well. It's a very big project, and I can't do it any justice in a sort of 40-minute presentation, but I hope I'll give you enough of an overview to let you understand what we've been doing. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge I haven't been doing this on my own. I've had a team working with me over the last few years, and would just like to recognise Kylie Hollins, Fabian Hill-Faskell, Lisa Riley and Shane Hasham at BHP, who've been working with me on this and getting it to the point where we are today. So, getting on with the presentation. What I'd like to run through today is just give you a bit of a flavour of the process. So, for maybe not everyone's familiar with strategic assessment, so a little bit of an overview of the strategic assessment process, not so much on the legislative process, but more how, I suppose, the philosophy around how this is working. Give a little bit of understanding of the scope of this particular project, an understanding, I suppose, some of the why we chose to go down this pathway, what's some of the rationale, and then a broader overview around the process that we went through and some of the key outcomes and timings as well. The assessment documentation is publicly available, and I've put a link to the website on the right hand side of the presentation, so if you haven't had an opportunity and you're interested, that's there for you, can be downloaded, and I've also included my contact details if anyone wants to follow up on anything. Okay, so the strategic assessment process. We went into this, this all started during the mine boom back in 2011, 2012, and we looked at how we were going to get approvals for some of our forthcoming projects, and we thought that there must be a better way to do this than project by project approvals, because we recognised, and in discussion with the regulators, recognised that particularly issues like cumulative impact assessments weren't being adequately addressed in that process. Particularly when we're looking at the Pilbara, and in that environment there was at that time a lot of projects being proposed and going through the approvals process. So I was looking at, is there a better way to do it? And the strategic assessment approach, both under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and the Western Australian Environmental Protection Act, has strategic assessment provisions in there, and we look to that as a way of an alternative way of delivering our project approvals. The analogy that we use when talking around what a strategic assessment is we use the analogy, it's a bit like, it's a two-step process, and it's a bit like a residential estate or an industrial estate, in that the first step is that big plan. You need to get approval for that plan. The plan tells you where the roads and the parks are, but you can't actually build anything. There is a secondary stage which you need to go through, which, you know, the analogy we use is like your building approval. So we need to get that first plan for the industrial estate or the residential estate, and then your building approvals, and that's essentially, both under the EPBC Act and the State Act, is the process that we go through. I'm not going to dwell overly on the actual regulatory process, but for example, in the state process, that first stage is the strategic proposal, and that's an assessment of a regional scale. It's where the primary approval occurs and conditions are attached to that first stage, the approval. But we can't go ahead and develop a project at that point. We need to go through what they refer to as the derived proposal, which is when we bring on an individual project, we need to go through a validation and verification process that we can meet the conditions set in that first stage. So it's a two-step process. Similarly, under the EPBC Act, we go through the first step of getting endorsement of a program. In our case, it could be a plan or program, and that sets out the nature of the proposal, has an accompanying impact assessment, and sets out the process that BHP will go through in order to demonstrate to the Minister that we can meet the objectives of the Act. We can't actually develop anything at that stage. We need to go through, then get an approval of a class of actions. So both legislations have essentially a two-part process there in simplistic terms. So it's very different than the standard development proposal and impact assessment process that people see, and one of the issues has been familiarising people with the fact that it is a different process, but the checks and balances are still there. It still has to meet the same tests under the Acts. Strategic assessments have been undertaken in a number of places within Australia, and under the EPBC Act, from a whole range of things, from residential developments through to fire management policy in South Australia to Great Barrier Reef. In the state process, more around development for residential or industrial developments. The big difference for us is that this is the first time a corporation has been the proponent. Typically it has been government, or where there hasn't been a planning instrument or something similar in place to support the proposal. So it's been a little bit different for us, and as a result we've had to work through with the regulators to make sure that they're comfortable that the right checks and balances are in place, and that we can provide the same level of assurance to the Minister that the approval can be delivered and the objectives met. So it's slightly different for us, and being applied to the resources sector, and being applied at quite a large scale, it's something different that has required a fair bit of work to understand and get the mechanisms right, and we think we've landed at that point. So getting into the scope of our assessment, what we're seeking as part of this approval is the development of future iron ore mining hubs or projects up for the next 50 to 100 years. So it's we're seeking a long-term approval for development of and continuing of development of mining operations in the Pilbara. We've been operating in the Pilbara since the 1960s, so we've had a long association with development in that area, and because our expectation is that we're going to continue operating for decades to come, we want to set up a framework, and we believe the strategic environmental assessment sets us up for an approvals framework that will cover us over that period. It covers all the mining and associated infrastructure. It has a focus around our central Pilbara operations, and I'll show a map in a moment. And also, because it's a long-term approval, what we're seeking as part of that it allows for acquisitions and divestments through that process. So if we acquire new mining leases or want to divest them, that the approval allows for that. The key thing that it looks at is the cumulative impact, so both from our existing and future operations, but also from other operators in the area. So current and proposed development. So it's the first time that a cumulative impact assessment's been attempted in the Pilbara. There will always be room for improvement, and I think as we mature in the cumulative impact space, the way that's been approached will be adapted and improved over time. But it's the first time that anyone's had a go at looking at that cumulative impact component. We've excluded out of the scope our existing approved operations, ones that are going through the approvals process, and our northern Pilbara operations, and also our port operations at Port Hedland. We excluded that because that process went through a separate approval back in 2012 for expansion of the port, and so we abutted the two approvals up together, but I'll touch on those things in a moment. So not all of you may be familiar with the Pilbara area. So the Pilbara region itself is about 500,000 square kilometres, so it's about twice the size of Victoria, to give you a bit of scale. It's a tropical arid environment. We get about 200 to 350 millimetres of rain per year, which is very cyclone driven. So we get our cyclone season from November to March, and the photo that you can see there gives you a bit of an idea of some of the landscapes. The Hamersley Ranges, in which we operate, is quite a spectacular area. It's a very old landscape. The biophysical environment, or the ecological environment, is in quite good condition, even though the area was opened up for grazing in the late 1800s. There is strong continuity through and connectivity through the landscape. The condition of the landscapes and the vegetation is typically considered excellent or pristine, so it is a very stable and environment, but still subject to pressures, particularly from things like introduced ferals, changes to fire regimes, and of course mining is one of those. It's a very hot environment as well. Regularly gets up to high 40s and 50 degrees. And for those of you who like obscure records, Marble Bar in the Pilbara holds the world record for 160 consecutive days of temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 39 degrees, back in 1923-24. So it's a pretty hot and inhospitable part of the world, but pretty spectacular nonetheless. The second photo there, again, just gives you an idea of the ruggedness of the landscape, dominated by the spinifex that you can see in the foreground, the acacias, and that picture is overlooking Fortescue Marsh, which is listed on the Australian Directory of Important Wetlands as one of the key environmental assets that we need to consider in this process. For those not familiar with iron ore mining, a brief introduction. So those ridge lines are typically where the iron ore sits, the Brockman and Marramamba iron ore, which is the focus of our operations and others in the region. Typically, and this is a photo of a typical operation where we have a series of mine pits, and in this case they're digging into those ridge lines. There's not a lot of waste material overburden, but we do have some, and they're stored in waste rock dumps around the mine, and some infilled back into pits depending on the operation. And then there's a lot of associated infrastructure, crushers and screening plants for crushing the iron ore. Iron ore is a very simple process. There's not much, if any, processing involved. It's pretty much digging it up, putting it on a truck, and then sending it by rail to port. And so there's associated rail facilities and administrations and workshops. So this is a typical sort of mine. And it's also in a typical setting. If you look behind that operation, it's a very large landscape that we operate in. As I said, it's the Pilbara area itself is 500,000 square kilometres. So it's whilst the operations are, and we'll see in some of the maps, focused in particular areas, it is a quite a large landscape. And finally, on the scope aspect is then the study area, for want of a better term. The areas that you can see on the map there, the light coloured or grey areas, is the BHP Billiton, our existing mining tenure. So that's the focus of this study. So there's potentially 14 different future mining hubs within that area. And the nominal study area that we've selected in orange, in yellow there, is essentially a 50-kilometre buffer around those operations, effectively known as the coat hanger, and our rail corridor going north to Port Hedland. So that's the focus of the study area. So we're looking at considering the implications of operations within that area. And in green you can see a couple of the key conservation areas, and particularly Karajini National Park, which is directly adjacent to some of our future operations. Karajini is one of the primary conservation areas in Western Australia, and if you ever get a chance to visit it, I highly recommend it. Spectacular area, but again, being adjacent or near our operations is one thing that we need to be highly aware of in consideration of our future management. Jamie, did you want to send the poll out then? Just a quick check to see whether people feel that they've got an understanding of the scope. In the absence of being able to get direct feedback, we're relying on some of the tools of this package to give us a little bit of feedback as we go. Okay, I think we're right to go. So one of the questions when we, both internally and externally, that we had when we started on this process was why do we want to go down through a strategic assessment process? And we needed to be clear that going down this pathway there were definite benefits for the business, but we also needed to give regulators and stakeholders confidence that we were still going to be held accountable to the requirements of the relevant legislation, and that the appropriate checks and balances were still going to be in place, so that for a long-term approval over a large area, that the stakeholders and the regulators still had confidence that the process would work. And there, we saw a number of benefits both from a business and an environmental outcome perspective in pursuing this process. Certainly from a business perspective, seeking an approval which gave us essentially in principle approval for development for the next 100 years was very attractive from a business perspective. It also enabled us, because going through that two-stage process, and I'll look at that in a bit more detail, but going through that two-stage process means that a lot of work is done up front and the approvals granted up front, which means that from a business perspective we can be more responsive. And any of you who have been in the environmental approval space will know that approvals are always considered to be on the critical path. Whether they actually are or not is a different matter, but to be able to be more responsive to the business, provide greater levels of flexibility and optionality to the business was certainly something attractive from our perspective. We also recognise that we believe we can deliver better environmental outcomes by looking at a more strategic process. And we use the term focusing on the things that matter. So really stepping back from and looking things at that regional and landscape level and say, what are the key environmental assets, what are the key species, what are the key values that we need to be focusing our management on, rather than at a project by project basis looking outwards and saying, well, here's my project, what are the impacts going to be? So I was trying to flip the discussion on its head and really look at what are the things in that landscape, in that scale, that we really need to be focusing on. And that aligned very much with the thinking from the regulators around looking at more outcome-based focus, looking at cumulative impacts, and it's helped us build a greater alignment with our approach with the regulators, both at a state and a Commonwealth level. The other benefit that we saw was from a compliance perspective. At the moment we have 5 operations and we have approximately 20 major approvals for those operations that have been granted over a number of decades. All those approvals have unique condition sets which are all different, which all have different requirements for management plans, for reporting, for monitoring, and in some instances we have 2 or 3 approvals over the same mining operations, which make it difficult both for the site operations people and also from a compliance and regulatory perspective to understand what's going on at a particular site and what things need to be done. Looking forward, we thought the strategic assessment process offered us an opportunity to be much more strategic and structured and consistent around that compliance requirements and make them much more outcomes focused rather than monitoring for the sake of monitoring and undertaking activities because that's the way it's always been done. So it was really looking at to build in a more outcome focused and adaptive management and embedding that in the management approach that would allow us to have much more streamlined compliance and reduce the compliance burden both for ourselves but also from the regulators, that there would be a much more consistent approach and much more contemporary approach that we could be offering around compliance. So those 3 key areas were what we could take to the business and what we've been able to take to our stakeholders and the regulators to talk around. These are the benefits we see in this approach and why we've pursued it. Jamie, I'll ask you again if you could send that poll. Again, it's just really getting your feedback as to that makes sense, that project justification makes sense. It's one area that we've had a lot of feedback and initially people were quite sceptical of why we were going down this approach, and there must be something, some great advantage for BHP that they'll be able to avoid doing certain things, but the strength of the strategic assessment process in my mind is that it still has to meet the same tests, it still needs to demonstrate that same rigour, but it does so in a slightly different way.
And Bryce, just quickly, that was 100% yes from everyone, so It's all understood.
Excellent. Okay, so getting into a little bit of the detail around the process. So one of the first things that we did was to start looking at what data we got available to inform our assessment. So we've undertaken over the last, particularly over the last decade, a considerable amount of biological studies, flora and fauna studies over our tenure. So for most of the tenure within the assessment area, we've got probably 90% coverage of flora and fauna surveys in that area, so that's over 400,000 hectares. So there's a huge amount of data that we've got. In addition, we sought what was available elsewhere through Department of Parks and Wildlife, through Atlas of Living Australia, through other sources, the Western Australian Museum and so forth, to really build up that regional picture. And so there's a lot of consultation and engagement as well. And slide 10 is really, and it's quite a busy slide, but it's really looking at what are the key environmental features in the area and understanding what are the, from an ecological perspective, what are the things that we need to focus on. And so we went through a process of looking at clearly what's covered under legislation. So in Western Australia, the priority and threatened ecological communities and listed species and so forth, but also other areas that have values associated with them. And one of the areas, for example, that shows up in the darker green in that map is areas that have been recently excluded from the pastoral estate in Western Australia. And the intent is that they will be considered for inclusion in the conservation estate at some point. So whilst not in the conservation estate at the moment, there are areas that we need to consider in that light. So it's really building up a picture of what are the things that we really need to be focusing on. We could also build up, so slide 11 is just a snapshot of conservation significant fauna records. So we're able to build up a snapshot of what information was available and again how that informs our assessment. Now I mentioned before there is a considerable bias, survey bias in Western Australia and the Pilbara region around mining operations, so you do get these massive clusters of records around proposals. We need to take that into consideration, but at least it does allow us to start painting that picture and get an understanding of where our operations sit in relation to the information that we've got available to us. So it's starting to build up that picture, and clearly there's a whole range of other information that we considered as part of this. Then we start getting into some of the more interesting, or also more challenging and newer areas. Starting to look at that cumulative impact assessment story. So for the assessments we considered both the existing operations, so both ourselves and other mining operations. So slide 12 shows our operations in orange and other company operations in pink. And it starts to demonstrate that in that area, so we're looking at an area that's probably 250 kilometres east-west and 200 kilometres north-south, so quite a large area, but still a number of operations in proximity to each other. What we then did was to look forward and get the crystal ball out, and so we had a fair idea of where, based on our tenure, where our operations would likely to be over the next 100 years, but we also looked at, for other proponents, what operations are reasonably foreseeable that we can incorporate in this assessment. So we looked at operations that have been approved but not developed, and then other operations that are in the approvals process as a guide to what's reasonably foreseeable. In this slide as well you can see Fortescue Marsh in the top centre. That's, I mentioned it before in one of the photos, that's a key environmental feature of the region, along with the Karajini National Park. So certainly they're iconic features that we need to be aware of. And Fortescue Marsh in particular had been a focus from a regulatory point of view because of concerns around potential cumulative impacts to those operations. So if you take into consideration those reasonably foreseeable operations, slide 13 starts to give you that picture of the cumulative story, and you could understand why there's been some concerns around the cumulative impacts, particularly in relation to Fortescue Marsh. Now, this is a worst case scenario in that, in fact, it puts down all future operations in one print, and what we've done as part of this, and it's the first time it's been done, is to look at that a conceptual disturbance area. So, as I said, it's the first time someone's tried to map this cumulative assessment story piece for the Pilbara, and it doesn't. This particular map doesn't take into account what areas will be rehabilitated, and clearly those operations would be staged over a 100-year period, but it does paint that picture around the potential direct disturbance in this area. And the other thing it points out is the proximity of some of those operations. They're quite close together, and so the issues of cumulative impacts and cumulative management start to become more pronounced. But this has enabled us to take forward this assessment piece, and this is the basis of the assessment that we've used. So we have that understanding of the existing environment using the information that's available to us, an understanding of future operations, in this case direct disturbance, but also then looking at indirect disturbance, particularly associated with surface and groundwater. So I'll run you through I suppose the philosophy around the approach and give a bit more context to this two-step process and what that means. And it's been a challenge for us in communicating this to stakeholders because it is different. People are used to seeing an impact assessment study in a particular way, and it's pretty uniformly done around the world, and this is a little bit different, and people have taken a while to get comfortable with it. And I think the process that we've ended up at, I think, delivers that comfort and delivers the confidence that the assurance and the checks and balances are in place. So I'll use water as an example in how this works. And the three columns there I've used are the things that you typically see in an impact assessment study. We understand what the existing environment is, we do an assessment, and then we look at the management and mitigation that we would put in place. So at the regional stage, again using water as an example, we're looking at understanding that existing environment, the regional water systems, groundwater, surface water, how those systems work, what are the drivers behind those at that regional scale, and in this case this is a large catchment scale. We then move into the assessment process, and because we're looking at a 100-year approval, we don't have detailed mine plans for mines that might not be built for 50 years. So we're not looking at trying to quantify the impacts as we might in a typical impact assessment. It's taking that step back and looking at what's the potential for us to change, and what are the risks associated with this development proposal. So for water, for example, we've looked at, on that existing environment, what are those sensitive environments, the water environments, so things that are sensitive to ground and surface water change, and then the assessment looks at what's the potential for us to change the hydrology of those areas and look at the cumulative effects of doing that. So we're really highlighting what areas are at risk, and I'll show a figure in a moment, what areas are at risk, potential risk for change, and then from an environmental management perspective, looking at what's a regional water strategy, what's a regional approach to management that we can put in place that will be focusing on delivering to meet particular objectives, and setting up an adaptive management framework that when we go down to this next step, this local scale, we've got a framework in place there that can take those considerations on and put in place appropriate management strategies to meet the objectives that we've set at that regional scale. So that's the regional scale, so that's the strategic proposal, so this is the state process, but similarly for the Commonwealth. And that's at that level, that's where conditions are set and approvals granted. When we come to deliver a specific project, so an individual mine, we need to, at a local scale, go through this derived proposal process. And that's where we will do a validation and verification piece to take a closer look at the water systems and understand that existing environment around a particular project area. We'll do the validation and verification piece as part of that assessment to confirm that we can meet the conditions set in the strategic proposal. And we can then, and to demonstrate that, we'll have catchment water management plans that will be focused on that local scale, that will have identified those key environmental areas and have set outcomes, indicators and thresholds that we will meet, and they will be developed in conjunction with the regulators, and that's what we will report against and be held accountable to. So there's that regional piece that sets that framework at that regional scale, that focus at that larger scale around the key environmental assets, and then a validation and verification piece at that local and derived proposal scale. And we do a similar process with the state, with the Commonwealth, sorry, that's focused in this case more around individual species rather than environmental assets. So hopefully that makes sense. It's really around, at that regional scale, identifying the risks and setting up that regional management framework, and then at a local scale doing that verification and validation and building in adaptive management through those regional and local scale management plans. So moving on to how we've actually applied that in the assessment. For some of those, it's quite straightforward. So slide 15 is using air quality as an example, where it's very much a similar assessment. We go out and do, as you would normally see in an impact assessment, where you go out and from a cumulative perspective we can map dust generation, for example. We can go out and map sensitive receptors, which show up on this map in the little green dots, and do an assessment as you would to identify where we might be exceeding certain thresholds that are set in regulations. Where it gets a bit more different, a bit different, is around the water story. And the water's much, is the key issue that we're sort of working around from an environmental perspective in the Pilbara. And we had to make a different approach to this because we couldn't quantify, we couldn't go out and do detailed hydrogeological modelling because we don't have the mine plans. So it's really focusing around understanding what the sensitivity, so in this particular slide it's looking at groundwater, so what are the groundwater sensitive ecosystems in the area, and what's the potential for us to create change, in this case to draw down the groundwater as a result of mining operations. So the focus of this approach is to identify those areas that are susceptible to change and sensitive to change, and they'll become the focus of those management plans going forward. So this figure, and it's a little bit busy, but for example in the zoom in box on the middle bottom, Willy Wally Springs is a key environmental asset. It's, as a spring, supports groundwater dependent ecosystems and surface water dependent ecosystems. Changing the, drawing down the groundwater there has the potential to impact on that system, so it's showing up as having a high potential for change. But this figure doesn't take into account any mitigation and management measures. So this is the risk assessment, if you like, that we undertake at that regional scale, identifies those areas that have got potential for change, and becomes the focus then of those management plans. And for each of those areas we'll then look at what are specific outcomes we want to meet for those, what are indicators, thresholds that we'll set in conjunction with the regulators to manage those going forward. And they become quasi-regional management plans in that where there might be multiple operations impacting on those, they'll all work to the same outcomes and objectives. And we've actually put that in place with some of our existing operations recently, where we have moved towards this more outcome-based regional management approach around, particularly around water, where we have a number of BHP Billiton operations operating to meet the same targets and objectives at sensitive environmental areas. We've done something similar and one of the challenges of this was, this whole study was undertaking this cumulative impact assessment piece and how detailed that was going to be. You know, I'm sure all familiar with the theories of you know, fully synergistic models around cumulative impact assessment, but to be able to deliver that, we didn't have confidence in the science and we didn't have confidence in the data that we could adequately do that. And so we've approached this around a series of cumulative impacts assessments around themes. So, for example, from a water perspective, in the Commonwealth perspective, we looked at 5 species that were the matters that were relevant to this assessment, and we were able to do a slightly broader assessment in this case. So the example here on slide 17 is looking at Greater Bilby, and to understand what the impacts of our operations might be on that species, we were looking at, are we likely to impact on suitable habitat, and if so, what's that impact likely to be? So we looked at that at a regional scale. So this particular figure shows a map of the Pilbara bioregion. The green dots are records, known records, and you can see there's quite significant bias, particularly along the rail corridors for ourselves and others that go up north. There's been a lot of survey work done there, but it gives an idea of where our operations are located in relation to that preferred habitat. We're able to include in that assessment then, we undertook some statistical modelling to look at that potential distribution of habitat, preferred habitat, and overlay those operations on that and look at direct and some indirect impacts on that. So that process in the 3 boxes below was the process that we went through from the Commonwealth perspective to understand what the potential impacts might be on those 6 matters of NES, and we're able to conclude that we didn't believe that we were going to have a significant impact, primarily as a result of the location of our operations in relation to those preferred habitat distributions. But one of the key things we need to build into this process is looking at adaptive management and things like climate changes and changes to threats. For example, things like cane toads. Those are the sorts of things we need to be able to build into the adaptive management process going forward. So slide 18 is just a quick summary around the findings of the work we've done, and we believe that in the most cases there will be a couple of the factors that the EPA refers to that we can continue to manage as business as usual because we have the appropriate systems and frameworks in place to do so. So for example, from a heritage perspective, we have detailed agreements with the native title groups that we work with that cover that and deal with that in a way that meets both legislative requirements and the group's requirements. And because we don't have a lot of sensitive amenity areas in around our operations, we can continue to manage that through our closure and rehabilitation processes. But there will be some specific targeted management that we will need to put in place, either around specific species and flora and fauna species, hydrological processes in particular. There will be what we refer to as toolkits of management plans that we'll need to consider at a site-by-site basis and put specific management processes in place around managing to meet those outcomes that I talked about. And there will be some specific rehabilitation and closure outcomes that we'll need to work through, processes that we'll need to work through as well. But broadly speaking, we believe that we can meet the objectives of the EP Act and both the EPBC Act through this approach. And it's given us ability to look at that and consider that in a regional context rather than just as on a site-by-site basis. So finally, slide 19 just looks at the delivery timeframes. So we've been working on this for a number of years. both the state and the Commonwealth documents went out for public comment in March this year. There was a 12-week public review period for the state and a 6-week public review period for the Commonwealth. We are currently working through the submissions that we received on that and expect to have both response to submissions back to the state this month, and we'll be working to have a final program and impact assessment report back to the Commonwealth this month as well. Moving forward, we're hoping that we will have ministerial endorsement of the program and approval of the class of actions by the end of this calendar year, and the state process is a bit longer. We'll also be running into a state government election early next year, so we will work through that process, but again the hope is that we'll have this in place by middle of next year. We'll have the approvals in place. The pleasing thing was that the submissions that we did receive, there wasn't any significant critique of the impact assessment methodologies used, and we were working on some additional responses through that process, but it appeared to be that both external and regulatory stakeholders seem pretty happy with the approach that we've taken. So I will wrap up and leave time for some questions to come through. I suppose just in summary, what this process has allowed us to do is shift from that local to the regional scale, and that's been quite important for us to do that given the scale of the developments that we're proposing. It's allowed us to be more outcome focused and aligned with regulators, and to build in an adaptive management process that will enable us not only in the short term but the long term to consider things like climate change and changes that will no doubt occur with science and knowledge over time, but it does so in a way that locks in the checks and balances and provides the assurance to regulators and to our stakeholders that the processes that are in place are robust, the assessment's been sound, and that they can have confidence in the process moving forward. So I'll hand back to you, Jamie, if you want to deal with any questions people might have.
Thank you, Bryce. All right, so if there is anyone had any questions, if you click on the software panel, there'll be a little question section where you can type something in. I think we've got 2 have come through during the presentation. So if anyone else has anything they'd like to mention, feel free to type it in that box. Bryce, if you see on that bit of software as well where it says dashboard, and there's a little bit with questions and a number there, and you can click on that and view it, or I can send them through to you if you prefer me to do that.
I'm not seeing anything in that questions box at the moment.
That's all right. What I can do, I can just read them out if you like, and then you can answer them.
Sure.
Through that way. All right. Well, there's a lot coming through all at once. Give me 1 second. So we've got one here from Carolyn. How do you link strategies to the outcomes you are seeking for assets, indicators, and thresholds?
So what we were looking to cascade down, so looking at understanding what the requirements and the objectives of the acts are, and understanding what they meant, understanding then what our contributions to that, so where the acts might say they need to protect certain things, BHP as a proponent can't protect, but we can certainly contribute to that. So it's understanding what our objective is that sits underneath that, and then cascading from under that, then okay, if that's our objective, how do we come up with specific outcomes that will demonstrate that we can meet that objective. So as an example, around some that we've applied recently in relation to maintaining a specific environmental asset, it was looking at because of the baseline data that we've got, we can understand what might be the key drivers, what are the key, so one of the areas was a groundwater area, understanding we've got 30-40 years worth of monitoring there, we've got a very good understanding of what the natural fluctuations might be, so we can set some specific triggers around groundwater levels, around certain quality parameters that we believe, and in consultation with regulators, will demonstrate that we can meet those objectives. So it's cascading down from the Act to our set of objectives to having some specific outcomes for species or assets.
Thank you. All right. Next one comes from Michael O'Keefe, who's interested to understand if there was any consultation with other resource companies with current and future operations in and around the BHPB leases. For example, to really understand the cumulative impacts on the regional groundwater at strategic level. Can this be done in isolation of other major perturbations, particularly where mining is occurring below the water table?
No, look, this is a really good question, and unfortunately we have to deal with the commercial realities that whilst we have used what's publicly available information is, so from approval documentation and so forth about those reasonably foreseeable projects, other businesses aren't prepared to lay their cards on the table necessarily and provide a direct competitor with information that could be commercially sensitive. So we do in instances work with other companies that we adjacent to and work collaboratively around things like water management because we share the same values and are also looking to minimise our impacts on similar areas. But there are commercial considerations that do restrict how well we can collaborate. We are and have had discussions around looking at models where a third party, for example CSIRO, might be the custodian of data that we could provide, and they could do things like groundwater modelling on behalf of a number of proponents, and that is one way that we could approach that. There is still some reluctance by certain organisations to contribute in that way, so it's a bit of a challenge that we haven't solved yet.
All right, thank you. I'm not sure we're going to have time for everyone's questions. There seem to be a lot all coming through at the end, but the next one's from Elizabeth Clark here. Following on from the mention of adaptive management, it is noted that adaptive management requires trial and error. Has BHP already commenced with any studies or have any in the pipeline to prepare for future adaptive management strategies, and how supportive are the regulators of such strategies?
Yeah, it's one of those things. Everyone knows that they need to be able to do it, but it's how you do it is a bit tricky. We're certainly applying adaptive management and fortunately have a very constructive relationship with regulators that we can look at how we're applying certain mitigation strategies and if they're working or not, and that's something that's going to improve over time, and setting up these outcomes indicators, thresholds, etc. will move us more in that direction. So it's something that we need to continually work on, and there is certainly a trust component in that, and both with regulators and other stakeholders to have trust that we're actually going to put adaptive management in place, and that if we're not getting the results, we need to be held accountable and we need to have alternative strategies that we can put in place. So water management is a classic one where we have done that for some time, and we have adapted in response to where we're either not getting the results that we expected, or we've found out that that we actually don't need to be doing certain monitoring or whatever because it's actually not informing a process. So it's still very much an evolving art, but it's something that this outcome-based process sets us up to do a lot better, I think, than we have done in the past.
Thank you. So it's getting a little bit close to 2 o'clock now, so if it's okay with Bryce, I might see if we can answer the rest of the questions in his own time, and we might put it together on a document on the EIANZ website for everyone to have a look at that. I've just got one question, and then we'll see how we go with that one. So it's from Ian Baxter. How does the assessment deal with changing conservation status and new listings?
Yep, so very good question, and both the state and the Commonwealth, certainly the Commonwealth, we've worked this through a little bit further, will have structured review periods in there. So we're looking at the class of actions, or the plans that we set up that will have regular review periods that will consider new listings, and then probably on a longer time frame, and we're talking maybe around 30 years, that will actually review the whole suite of the EPBC Act controlling provisions. So in a shorter term, maybe every 5 years, do a review of the controlling provisions that are relevant to the proposal, and then every 30 years do a clean sweep, so that we do have that. Because it's a long period of time, I think it would be unreasonable for us to say, no, we've got an approval in 2016 and that's it for the next 100 and so years. So no, we will build in those reviews into the process. I think that's an expectation from the community, that we would need to do that.
All right, thank you, Bryce, and thanks everyone for attending the first webinar with EIANZ. When you leave today, there'll be a little quick survey that will pop up. If you could have 1 minute to answer that to help us improve for the second one. Hope everything went well, and on behalf of EIANZ and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great day.